Now I'm going to introduce our very good friend, an AFL member, I might add, Derek Baxter. And Derek Baxter is the author of Pursuit of Jefferson, Traveling Through Europe with the Most Perplexing Founding Father, and also his new book, The Forgotten World War. And it's good to know, Derek, that you put Lafayette on the front of your book. That made me very, very happy. I'm very honored to have you here with us, Derek. You're a very active member. You come to all of our events. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chuck. Thanks, everybody, for coming out here. This is a book about the American Revolution as a world war. So we know about Lafayette and the French contribution, which may be even more important and profound than perhaps you even realize. But actually, the Revolutionary War went beyond the French, beyond even Lafayette, as hard as it is to believe. There were 5 different nations involved in this grand coalition that fought the British, and my new book is trying to, put a spotlight on them. And so it began. The book kicks off not on the 4th of July, but El Cuatro de Julio, a 4th of July celebration in Spain, in the hills of Andalusia. And the gentleman on the left, he's actually an actor, Jose Galvez, but he is portraying his ancestor, Bernardo de Galvez, who is the Spanish general whose birthday is today. So happy birthday, Bernardo de Galvez. I didn't know much at all about him. I don't think I had heard of him before I embarked on this research. But frankly, I saw a lot of parallels between Galvez and Lafayette. They were both young. Galvez was a little older than Lafayette, who was, impossibly young, but he was still only in his early 30s. And both these bold, daring commanders who thought outside the box. And I think most of all, both Lafayette and Galvez were really good about bringing people together and looking out for the interests of their allies and beyond their own self-interest of, what would be good for their own careers. They really did want to help. They had their eyes on the prize of achieving American independence and winning this war. So I saw him as a little bit like a Spanish Lafayette in some characteristics. So that was part of what I really loved about this project and this book that I did, was a chance to learn about some of these other hidden heroes of the Revolutionary War. So Andalusia puts on this 4th of July pageant, which is just crazy because it's a tiny little village. And where else in Spain are they even thinking about the 4th? And here they've got beer and fireworks and hot dogs, and they're playing the Star Spangled Banner. So we felt just at home. And there they are recreating the Battle of Pensacola, Florida, which was a very key battle of the Revolutionary War, which we don't hear much about it. And they do all this because Bernardo came from that village. His family actually started as a family of shepherds, very poor background, and they worked their ways up. His uncle was the one who really elevated the family. His uncle became the minister of the Indies, so he was in charge of Spanish policy toward their colonies in North America. And I went there with my family. It was just a way to connect to this larger global war that was the Revolutionary War. I learned about the true scope, I think, of the war through Mercy Otis Warren. So she was the first female historian in the U.S. She was a poet and a playwright, very satirical, friends with the Adamses in Massachusetts. And she started writing this history even while the Revolutionary War was on. In fact, even before the Declaration of Independence was signed. So as you may know, as you probably do know, being AFL members, the war started a full year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. There was a shooting war already. And Mercy was one of the people right there in the midst of it. Her husband was in the Massachusetts Congress. He also served in the Continental Army, and Mercy helped organize the boycotts. And so she had access. She met Lafayette and hosted Lafayette in her house. She hosted the Washingtons. She hosted one of Bernardo de Galvez's officers. So she was getting access to these people in real time. She began writing her history. It took her a long time to publish, in part because of health issues and many other things, which I won't get into, but it came out in the early 1800s, and Jefferson said she deserved high station in the ranks of genius. He was very taken by one of the very first histories. So actually, I actually came across this book. As Chuck mentioned, my first book deals with Thomas Jefferson and his travels, following his travels around Europe. And Jefferson owned this copy that we're looking at now. It's now in the Library of Congress. Can't really see it too well, but if you look at the picture, there is a bit of a scorch mark right to the bottom right-hand side, the bottom right of volume 1. That's because this copy survived this fire in the Library of Congress and is there to this day. So I saw it in this exhibit of some of Jefferson's prized books that are in the Library of Congress. I was so interested in the story that I started to read it. You can read it online. And I was so taken by the fact that Warren wrote about the Revolutionary War. She went way beyond the 13 colonies. She wrote about the fighting here, but this was just one theater of the war. And there were several theaters. And she wrote all about what happened in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean and the North Sea and even in India. And another thing that I found interesting was she did all this very matter-of-factly. So she wasn't trying to sell people, her readers, on the fact that this was a world war, which is how I feel sometimes. Like I have to kind of shake people by the collar, like, no, trust me, believe me, this war is actually a world war. But her readers knew this already. They were following this in American newspapers, which were covering these battles. And Washington and Franklin and all the rest were tracking what was going on all around the world. So I found this just a fascinating story. And so I set off on the road to find out more about it, because just like I did on my Jefferson project, that's really how I love to interact with history. As I think probably Kat and some others will tell you, I love to go out there as a lot of you do, and see reenactments and see the battlefields. And that's what I want to do here, to see what are some, we know about some of the big battlefields here, and Yorktown and Bunker Hill and all. What about all of those around the world, and what can you see today, and who might still be there, who can share you these stories, local historians, reenactors, descendants of people involved. So I tried to find them wherever I went. So I set out on this journey, and here are a few slides to talk about what I found. So in my research, first of all, I think when Washington, to kind of back up and set the stage a little bit, June of 1775, Washington has now taken command of the newly formed Continental Army. He went up there to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was just shocked at what he saw. The troops were missing a lot of things, but most of all, he couldn't believe that his men only had 9 rounds of gunpowder each. So the British were in Boston, the Continentals were encircling them, and if the British sallied forth and attacked the Continentals, they could only shoot 9 times and then have to leave. I mean, that's not a way to run an army. It's because we didn't produce enough gunpowder here. We didn't produce many other things as well. And so in those early years of the war, Washington's army survived in large extent because of the smuggled gunpowder that the French and the Spanish and the Dutch sent up from the Caribbean. And we're really dependent on that. But that wasn't enough. So as many of us know, that first year of the Revolution after the Declaration of Independence was signed was very difficult for Washington. He lost several battles in and around New York City and was driven back. And these are really dark times for the American army and the cause. And so it put, I think, the Declaration of Independence kind of into perspective, that really we were seeing it in a way as a sort of lifeline. So we often focus on the Declaration and Jefferson's preamble and the beautiful words that were intended, of course, for Americans. But the Declaration just as much was intended for a foreign audience, because we wanted to bring France and Spain, the 2 superpowers of the day, into the fight. They were already, as I said, supplying us with gunpowder and giving us gifts of money and sending surplus cannon our way, but we needed more, and including we needed their navy, because the British Navy, His Majesty's Navy, was the greatest naval fleet in world history up until that point. And America didn't have one. We were just starting to build ships, but there's no way we could take on the British Navy at the height of the age of sail. So we appealed to the 2 pictures you see here are King Louis XVI of France and King Carlos III of Spain, 2 countries that had fought Britain, of course, during the 7 Years' War when Lafayette's father was killed. the war that we call here in North America the French and Indian War. And that war, of course, was a total catastrophe for France and Spain. They both lost a lot of territory. France lost Quebec, Spain lost Florida and the southeastern US and other land as well. And so France and Spain were very interested in effect, getting back at England. But they obviously didn't want to repeat the errors of the previous war, and neither one of them was ready to take on the British Empire in 1776. And so Americans had to survive the best they could for an entire almost 2-year period after the Declaration of Independence, waiting to see if any of these superpowers would join the war and come to their aid. And so I explore in my book, that's where Lafayette, our beloved Marquis, enters the picture. And so I did some travel. He's just one of many characters, of course, I profile in the book. But this is where he came, of course, and other European volunteers came to aid the cause. Who, some of them were charlatans, but some of them obviously were instrumental, like Lafayette, like Baron von Steuben, the Prussian drill master, or Kosciuszko, whose name I always mispronounce, but he who was instrumental in developing the fortifications at Saratoga. So, as I said, as I wrote this book, it's part travelogue and part history. So I went to a lot of places and tried to engage with people and learn what I could. So here on the left, I am at Pasaya, where I know there's an exciting announcement that the AFL is gonna go there next year, which is really cool. So when Lafayette was escaping from France, because of course he was, as we all know the story, he was so highly placed that the French government did not want him to leave France. They thought this could, in effect, even though they were letting other French volunteers leave and turn a blind eye, Lafayette was so close to the court. If he left, it might look as if France were tacitly sending him there, and it would provoke war right then. And the French court was not ready to enter into war in April of 1777. So Lafayette, of course, bought the Victoire himself, the ship, and hung out in Bordeaux for a while and got worried that the French authorities were going to haul him back to Paris. And so then he sailed to San Sebastian and then Pasaya, which is the really good port near San Sebastian in the Basque country of Spain. And so there's a plaque marking the spot where Lafayette took off from. And very conveniently, there's an ice cream store right below it. So if you ever go, you can definitely have some ice cream while you're admiring Lafayette on the plaque. And one of the earliest AFL events that I had the pleasure of going to was in Philadelphia, where the wonderful Mark Schneider gave a talk about how Lafayette came to Philadelphia and his reception there. So I include some material from Mark about those early days of Lafayette arriving in the United States. And of course, there's a lot of skepticism of all these European volunteers. And he would famously tell Washington later, "I'm here to learn, not to teach." And his willingness to serve for free also just endeared himself to the Americans. But I've got a little bit of a contest here. I have a few of these maps of the Revolutionary War as a world war. So I'm gonna give them out to a couple times during this presentation to people who can answer the question right. So if you can put it in the chat, I actually can't see the chat, but maybe Chuck or somebody can monitor it for me. And
I got your back.
Okay, Derek. Great. All right. So the first, if you want, you can put the answer in the chat and email me later. I'll put my email in the chat when I'm done here. It's Derek at Jefferson Travels, and so I'll arrange to send it to you. And so my first question, I'm pretty sure you all are going to get this. I gave a talk last night and nobody came close to getting it, but I think you all will. So 1777, the Americans are waiting for France or Spain to make up their mind to see if they will join us as allies. Neither one has. But that year, we got our first ally in the war, and it was much closer to home than the French or Spanish were. So who were America's first allies? That's the question.
I'm monitoring. Native American, Stephanie Billon.
Yes, they were. And can anybody be a little more specific? I'll say Lafayette certainly had a wonderful relationship with them.
Oneida, Morgane Sutton. Morgane and Beck and Derek Sutton and Paul D'Agostine pretty much tied on that one.
Okay, well, we will have our election monitors later and figure this out. But the Oneida were America's first allies. They joined the cause. They were one of the 6 Iroquois or Haudenosaunee nations, four of which actually chose to ally with the British because they were so concerned about American settlers encroaching west and taking their lands. The Oneida chose to ally with the Patriots, and they had cultural ties and religious ties to Americans in upstate New York. And they were very critical in the Saratoga campaign. So this year of 1777 that I keep coming back to, we don't have help from abroad. The British had come close to defeating Washington catastrophically in the field in 1776. They wanted to finish off the war in this year, very much so because they knew the French and Spanish were considering coming in, and Britain just wanted to end it. They had actually wanted to end it in 1776. Now they really wanted to end it in 1777 before it became a world war. There were 2 campaigns, which I'll just mention briefly, one of which General Howe went south and took Philadelphia, and that's where Lafayette acquitted himself, very well on the fields of Brandywine. But the Americans lost that ultimately. But the Saratoga campaign, the second one, was a tremendous victory. And we captured Burgoyne's army in upstate New York at Saratoga, but the victory belonged to a lot more than the Americans. So first of all, the Oneida. There were 150 Oneida warrior at Saratoga. There were more who had fought in this key battle that was a lead up to Saratoga, Oriskany, that served as warriors and scouts. So they were a key part of it. The other part of it, kind of a hidden victor of Saratoga, was actually the French. The French were not in the war, but they were shipping tons of supplies to the Americans. So 90% of the war material that the Americans had at Saratoga actually had been sent to them from France. And so just the playwright Beaumarchais, who's such a character, just that spring, a few months before Saratoga, he had a shipment come in to Boston that sent the Americans 30,000 rifles, 400 tons of gunpowder, and 15,000 pocket handkerchiefs. So the French truly were thinking of everything. And with this great victory at Saratoga, the next year, France did decide to join the war. Not solely because of Saratoga. That, as I said, they wanted to anyway, and they were preparing their military and working on convincing Spain to join. But Saratoga helped, and Lafayette certainly helped. Not only was he pushing the court and advocating for independence and advocating for France to help in the war, he had become such a celebrity in Paris. The story of this aristocrat who left behind his lovely wife and fortune to go fight for a country that wasn't his own. I mean, it just captivated everybody. And the French court some of them were even getting fed up with him. One minister, Maurepas, said that Lafayette would sell all the furniture in Versailles to help the American cause if he could. But Lafayette was a great friend of America, but so was the gentleman on the left, the Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister. For my money, he was one of the most important people. I'd put him right up there with Washington and Lafayette in terms of how the war unfolded, because he was the guy who steered France into the war, the French foreign minister. Frankly, he was in favor of France's participation from the very beginning. As soon as he got a copy of the Declaration of Independence, just a month or two after it was printed, he went into Versailles. He went into the King's Council in Versailles and said, "Let's invade England now. Let's just go. Let's just send our fleet across the English Channel. They won't know what hit them." So he was the war hawk in the cabinet. Cooler heads talked him down, but for 2 years, Vergennes had been building up the French Navy in the dockyards in Brest and Toulon. They were building ships of the line one after another. And by 1778, with this news of Saratoga, Vergennes signed a treaty of alliance with Franklin in Paris, and sent the gentleman on the right, the Comte d'Estaing, from Toulon in the Mediterranean with a fleet. And this was a huge opportunity for France, because they knew exactly when they were declaring war and they were sending their fleet. The British and America were somewhat in the dark as to what was going on. There had been great hope that with the French in the war, in 1778, it would be over just then. It would be over in one fell swoop. That's certainly what Washington hoped. There was great joy in Valley Forge in May of 78 when the news came that France had entered the war. There was a big party and a barbecue, and Lafayette was kissing everybody on the cheek. And some of Washington's commanders said, well, is it over? Do we need to keep fighting? And the answer was very much that they did. The Comte d'Estaing did not get the job done for a whole variety of reasons, which I won't go into, but in just for time's sake in this presentation. But for one thing, he had hoped to take Newport, Rhode Island, the great deep water port, from the British who held it, and that was a big failure. The storm came up part of the reason was that he had to leave because of this terrible storm that damaged his ships. But there was a lot of problems of the French and Americans cooperating on the field there in Rhode Island, and a lot of bad blood. And in fact, later the French Navy sailed to Boston to repair their ships. There was so much bad blood that a gang of Americans actually spotted a couple of French officers walking home in the streets of Boston one night, and they set on them and started beating them up and actually killed one of the French officers. So the alliance was off to a terrible start. Washington was leaning on Lafayette to do whatever he could to make sure it didn't crumble. He told Lafayette, I beseech you to offer a helping hand to this wound that has been unintentionally made. So just because they're in the alliance didn't necessarily mean they were going to cooperate effectively yet. Also mentioning in 1778, I think one of the surprising, I think, aspects as I did this research and learned this story was just the effects of France entering the war on the British. So the British, of course, that winter were there in Philadelphia while Washington and Lafayette and others were suffering at Valley Forge. Everybody expected spring would come, the British would march out of Philadelphia and mop up the Continental Army. And that never happened because the British all of a sudden were worried about the French, and they were worried about losing their other colonial possessions. So London ordered the British in Philadelphia to evacuate. They had fought so hard at Brandywine and Germantown to take Philadelphia, and then they just left it. They marched out without a fight. Why? Because they need to send 5,000 troops to Jamaica and protect Jamaica, which was a colony that they frankly cared more about than Pennsylvania. That was the most profitable colony in the British Empire because of the sugar plantations. They also sent 3,000 men from Philadelphia down to protect Florida. So all of a sudden, we were just one theater and not always the highest priority of the British. We, of course, the Americans were suspicious, and Washington was always suspecting a trap and a feint by the British. And he sent Lafayette out, as you may know, to scout out the area. And he almost got trapped by the British at Barren Hill. The Oneida helped him there. Six Oneida died. Our AFL member Graham Brent sent me that picture that he took up there of Barren Hill. So the French were not able to win the war all at once in 1778. In 79, Spain finally entered the war. They decided the time was right. And most of the French objectives, neither France or Spain was doing this for the love of liberty. Unlike Lafayette, they were looking at this from a very, very cold geopolitical sense. The French wanted to right the balance of power in Europe. They thought that England had gone too far in the 7 Years' War and was too powerful in Europe, and countries were no longer looking to France for leadership. So they wanted to fix that situation. Spain, on the other hand, wanted their land back. So they had lost so many territories to the British in the 18th century. And the one they were particularly concerned about was the one you see on the left, Gibraltar. Has anybody been to Gibraltar before? It's a really fascinating place to go to. It's a 1,400-foot high promontory that commands the Mediterranean, so it's very strategic. The Moors had built a fortress there. Spain took it and held it for centuries, but then Britain won it in an earlier war. So Spain just wanted Gibraltar back more than anything. And they actually sent an emissary to King George III in 1779 before they entered the war to give him one last chance and said, listen, just give us Gibraltar and we promise we'll stay out of this war. You can do what you want with those colonies. And King George said no. he insisted on having Gibraltar. And Washington heard this story later, and he couldn't believe it. He thought that this decision, he said, was more tinctured with insanity than anything he'd ever heard before. Because, in effect, what King George III had done was trade the United States, trade the 13 colonies for Gibraltar. And so Gibraltar is still British today. So I guess that part of it worked out. But Spain entered the war. They immediately started a siege of Gibraltar for 4 years, which, as I've just spoiled the story, they did not succeed in taking it. But with Spain and France in the war, it truly was a world war. All of a sudden, there's fighting in Central America and Nicaragua between the Spanish and the British. There's all sorts of battles in the Caribbean as all these countries are taking each other's Caribbean islands. And there was fighting in Pensacola. I mentioned that on the very first slide. Here again is the birthday boy Bernardo de Galvez with his tremendous victory in Pensacola, which played a key role in the Yorktown campaign. So Britain was playing defense. They had no one on their side. It was, in effect, I kind of say it's the world against Britain. It wasn't, not everybody in the world was against Britain, but they did not have allies as they did in the 7 Years' War. And the British are very worried that their colonies all around the world are in jeopardy. And then finally, we have another European power that entered the war, and they had actually much earlier became the first country to salute the American flag. So here is another map-worthy event question. Which was the first country to salute the American flag? Any takers?
Our first person was Paul de Gastines. He said Netherlands.
Yes, that is correct. That is absolutely right. So it was the Dutch in the fall of 1776. So we'll back up on our story a little bit. After the Declaration,
Derek, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I thought Morocco was the first country to recognize the United States.
So they're the first to recognize, and actually that is correct. But they were the first to salute the flag with the cannon.
Got it.
Yes, a slight nuance, because people have guessed Morocco before as well, which makes a lot of sense. But this brig, the Andrew Doria, sailed into the island of St. Eustatius, nicknamed Statia, the Golden Rock, in the Caribbean. And so this is the key Dutch island at the time in the Caribbean. It's very small. It's only about a quarter the size of Manhattan. There's only 3,000 people that live there today. And there actually were quite a few more people in the 18th century. So it's fallen on hard times in a way. But it was the Golden Rock in the 18th century because it was a free port. It was strategically placed, and ships came from all over the Mediterranean, from all these trade routes to trade. And that's where Americans got so much of their smuggled goods from the Dutch and also from the French. So we would send small, fast ships down to Statia. They'd load up with gunpowder and sail back home. And so the ship came in the fall of 1776 with a copy of the Declaration, and we fired off a salute, and the Dutch returned the salute with an 11-gun salute. They were so taken by the American cause. This was actually turned out to be a problem because the Netherlands, as Chuck pointed out, did not actually recognize the United States, and this governor got a little carried away. They were not actually supposed to recognize the U.S. and salute our ship at the time. We were still officially rebels, and so they kind of had to walk it back afterwards. But so maybe the Dutch's greatest contribution wasn't saluting our flag, but it was smuggling all that gunpowder. And even in the middle of the war, something like 8 to 10 American ships were landing a day in Statia to load up with military supplies and send them back to America. So my wife and I got to go down there and visit, because they recreate and celebrate this salute every fall. And that was just a lot of fun and a lot of excitement there on the island. Another really interesting and surprising to me aspect of the war, once France and Spain and the Netherlands were in it, was the fact that the Allies attempted to invade England itself. So I told you that the Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, that's what he wanted to do way back in 1776. So finally in 1779, with the Spanish in the picture, they decided that they would they would send an armada. It was the largest armada since the time of the Spanish Armada in the 1500s to sail to England. There were 187 warships, and the idea was they would land and take Portsmouth and Plymouth in England, and then an invasionary force, which would be all French because the Spanish were so busy besieging Gibraltar. A French force based in Le Havre would sail on troop transports ships across the English Channel and march in. And the leaders of the expedition were none other than Rochambeau and the Marquis de Lafayette, who had sailed home and was back in France in 1779. So they were cooling their heels, waiting for the signal that they could go and sail to England and march on London. And what a story that would have been. The idea was, of course, not to actually conquer Britain. It was just to really scare them and to have the English stock market crash and just to end the war in one fell swoop, that Britain would just sue for peace and give the different members of the coalition what they wanted. Of course, it did not work out as planned, or you probably would have heard about this in your history books. They never made landfall. The French and Spanish had commanders, naval commanders, had all sorts of problems getting on the same page. It turns out they had different signal flags, so they didn't even understand the flags of the other ships. They had not had time to train and practice together. There were all sorts of delays, and finally disease started breaking out. See, some of these sailors had been in the heat on these ships for months at a time, and there was dysentery and scurvy, and they just became almost like floating death traps. And the invasion was called off, and Lafayette, of course, was disappointed. He had already asked the king. He had said, demanded the honor of being the first to reach that shore and the first to plant the French flag in the heart of that insolent nation. So it sounds like a very Lafayette-like quote, and I could completely see him landing at Portsmouth and leading the charge up towards London. But the benefit of this failed invasion was it did at least really scare the English, because the ships actually came within sight of the English coast, and people were panicking, and they were ordering miners from Cornwall to come and take old muskets and try to mount some kind of defense there. So it did really scare them. And then for the rest of the war, the English kept their home fleet in the English Channel with way more ships than they needed. So they had this huge fleet just protecting England for the rest of the war, and then depriving the British Army in North America of all these ships that they could have and should have had otherwise. So finally, I'll get to the last ally that was in the coalition, which is the most surprising of all for me, the Mysore Kingdom of India. And so this was an ally of the French. They were very angered that the British were attacking the French in India. And I should say, in India at this time was not like the India you might think of, say, 100 years later, under the Raj, with the Britain controlling almost all of the subcontinent. Instead, it's a patchwork. You have the East India Company, this multinational company with its own army and navy controlling different pockets of India. And the French and the Dutch were there, and many independent kingdoms still were, including the Mysore Kingdom. And so they came to their French allies' aid. They sent an army of 90,000 men marching across the plains of the Carnatic. And that number just boggles my mind. Washington, on a very good day, could put, say, 20,000 men on the battlefield and be happy about it. And so 90,000 men marching across India. They had cavalry. They had men riding horses, other men riding elephants, which, as you might imagine, definitely scared the British to see these elephants charging at them. And they had others firing these rockets at the British. So the Mysoreans had developed this technology, these rockets encased in iron tubes that were mobile, that they could bring to the battlefield. And the British were quite taken by this technology, and they later got some of it and studied it and copied it and incorporated it into their own army. And a couple of decades later, they tried it out in battle. And I guess this can be another opportunity to win a map if you're feeling lucky. What battle did the British use these Mysorean rockets in a good 2 or 3 decades after the Revolutionary War?
Crickets. I got crickets.
They're firing these rockets. Anybody heard of rockets popping up in later
Could it be the
wars?
War of 1812?
Yes.
No, there it is. Ernie Sutton.
There we
Sutton.
There
War
we go.
of 1812.
is the War of 1812. They used it. They used them in Baltimore, and that's what Francis Scott Key saw, the rocket's red glare. So we've sung this line a million times. They're talking about these rockets that the Mysoreans developed. I just love that story. And going to India was the farthest I certainly got on these travels. It was just really interesting to get way out there where some of these battles happened. And and I'll move quick in the interest of time. Of course, in 1780, the French landed with Rochambeau, and that's a picture of the Hermione, Lafayette's famous ship, unfortunately in dry dock in Bayonne when I saw it. And it came here years ago, so I bet some AFL members saw it. And Lafayette was in this ship to give advance word of the French expedition. So there is a force in Newport in 1780, but the British were able to blockade it, and the reinforcements that were hoped for did not come from France that year. And so Washington was very frustrated. He couldn't have the campaign that he wanted in 1780. And as 1781 dawned, the Allies actually were not doing as well as you would think. So they've got Britain fighting all around the world, and you'd think, and they outnumbered Britain at this point, you'd think they would be winning everything. But I've mentioned a couple of different examples of how it was hard for them sometimes to cooperate on the battlefield with each other, and it was hard to figure out what the priorities were. And the British actually had been winning just as many battles as they had been losing against this coalition. So as 1781 came, it was a really crucial time for the Americans. Washington's army was in bad shape. Morale was low. Men hadn't been paid. Continental money was hardly worth anything, and some people were starting to mutiny. And there was starting to be a thinking that 1781 might decide it all. If there wasn't a big Allied victory, the Allies, the French and Spanish, might decide to cut their losses. And there were starting to be rumors that there could be some kind of negotiated peace where Britain would get to keep the land that they had. So some American states would be free and independent, but the British were still in New York City, and they were still in large parts of Georgia and South Carolina. And so just very unclear how all this would end. And so that brings us to, of course, the masterful Yorktown campaign, where everything did almost miraculously come together, where Cornwallis foolishly let himself be maneuvered or stay on the York Peninsula in southeastern Virginia, with, of course, Lafayette keeping him in check there, and Washington and Rochambeau marching south, de Barras sailing south from Rhode Island, and then the French Admiral de Grasse sailing north and trapping Cornwallis there. But the Yorktown campaign, I think, is well known for sure, but there are aspects to it that came as big surprises to me, and I think hidden parts to the story. And there's one that, of course, many members of this group know of, James Armistead, who was an enslaved man in Williamsburg who was a double agent. He went to the British lines saying he would spy on the Americans. He served with Lord Cornwallis, waited on Lord Cornwallis, but was actually a double agent feeding information to Lafayette. He is the one who, and it's almost the anniversary in just a few days of when Lafayette got this information from James Armistead that the British we're going to Yorktown, and we're going to stay there. They're going to entrench themselves in Yorktown, which was key information that Lafayette sent up to Washington. And here is a picture of AFL member Moses Delaney, who I got to talk to for the book, and he told a very moving story about his own research into his ancestor, James Armistead Lafayette, and family stories. And so I included some of that in the book, and felt very privileged to have been able to have done that. So James Armistead played a key role, and others did as well at Yorktown. And really, I think a key thing to remember about the Yorktown campaign is just how important this the naval victory was. Because as I was kind of very briefly describing the plan to trap Cornwallis, that was all dependent on the French, of course, having naval superiority. Otherwise, the British Navy could just bail them out and sail the troops back to New York City. And de Grasse did win, of course, at the Battle of Chesapeake, which allowed them to trap Cornwallis. But what I found out in my travels and my research was that it wasn't so obvious that DeGrasse was going to be able to do that. And so he had two problems before he was able to leave with his fleet from the Caribbean. One was he was worried about the French islands. What would happen to them when he left? Maybe he should only bring half of his fleet, some of his fleet, and leave the rest behind. What if the British had their own fleet in the Caribbean? What if they took Saint-Domingue or Martinique, these islands that, just like Jamaica, were incredibly profitable? There was a Spanish emissary, Francisco de Saavedra, who convinced him to take all of his ships, take every last ship of the line, all 28 that he had, and Spain would protect the Caribbean. So this was what a change from the earlier years of the war. Here were the Allies looking out for each other and looking beyond their own self-interest, because Saavedra was there actually to really his orders from his king were to attack Jamaica and take it back for the Spanish. Instead, he put those aside for the time being and said, no, this is an opportunity that's not going to come up again. DeGrasse, you should go north with every last ship. The second problem he had, though, was that DeGrasse was out of money. He didn't have money to pay his sailors. He couldn't take on supplies. And he knew that Rochambeau and Washington himself, that both of them were very low on money, too, as they would be marching south. And so he needed money or he couldn't leave. He tried to raise it himself from French planters and couldn't. So again, the Spanish emissary said, I'll raise you the money. And he did so in one day. He got all the money needed for the Yorktown campaign. And my question for you is, where did this Spanish emissary in the Caribbean go to get all the money that paid for Yorktown? This answer certainly surprised me. Any
I
takers?
got Ernie Sutton saying Spain, Cuban donors.
It was Cuba. Yes, they went to. There were the Cubans and Spanish and Cuba that raised all the money. And so think about that the next time we're celebrating Yorktown, that actually it was the Cubans that made it possible. And so we won at Yorktown, but the war wasn't necessarily over. Cornwallis had lost around 7,000 men, but the British had 100,000 soldiers across their empire, and their fleets were almost all still intact. They could have fought on, and they did. They just didn't fight on in North America. That's why so often we think Yorktown was the last battle of the war. So the British stopped major land operations in North America after Yorktown, but the biggest battles of the war happened after Yorktown, because the World War kept going on for another year and a half, and there's battles in the Caribbean and battles in the Mediterranean, and some of the largest battles of the war happened in India, including the very final battle of the war, which happened in June 1783 in the town of Cuddalore. So by this time, the great powers back in Paris, Versailles, had agreed on preliminary articles of peace. So they had all agreed to stop fighting. But it took almost 6 months for the news to reach India. And so the British were trying to take the town of Cuddalore from the French and their Mysorean allies. They were fighting on land, there was fighting on the sea, and the French and the Mysoreans actually were winning the battle when all of a sudden a British ship sailed up with a white flag of truce and said, we're at peace. In fact, we've been at peace for 6 months. Lay down your arms. And the French and the Mysoreans were pissed because they were like, we were about to win this battle, and I guarantee if you had been winning, you would not have told us this news today. You would have sat on it. But the war ended right there, and I got to go to Cuddalore, which is way off the beaten track. And here I am at Fort St. David, which unfortunately is mostly in ruins behind this facade. It's the family of the caretaker that looks after it. And that was such a moving experience to think of just how far we had come. How far I had gone on these travels, but just how far the war had stretched around the world since Lexington and Concord. This Village Green and this completely different landscape here in southeastern India, 8,000 miles away. So those were my journeys. That was the material I put into this book. As I said at the beginning, it's out now, and really appreciate it if you get a copy, and I think you might find it interesting to see Lafayette's role, but also the role of all these other allies in the World War. And thank you, Morgan, for holding that up.
Okay, very good. Would you be so kind as everybody, for the Forgotten World War? Looks like you can get it to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Independent Bookstore, or DerekBaxterBooks.com. Thank you very much, Derek. Will you do me a
Sure.
favor and open up the screen for me? Thank you
Yep.
so
Right.
much. Now, I know we have some friends. Yeah, I got to say, I learned so much, Derek. It was really fascinating, and you're a very, very good speaker. And so that time went really fast, but I learned so many new things. Thank you so much.
Of course. Happy to. Thank
And you're
you.
getting hearts and claps, and thank you so much. And some of the chats were really fun too. So I know we have one question from an AFL member, Jenny Cote. Jenny, are you there?
Yeah. Hey, sorry, I have no chat box or video, so sorry I'm like a black hole. But Derek, thank you so much for your talk. It was awesome.
Thank you.
And I'll be getting a copy of your book. But I have a question. I'm actually currently writing my 4th book on in my Revolution series from April 77 through Monmouth, so Lafayette's arrival. But I'm doing something kind of interesting. You know, while all this stuff was happening back east, out on the West Coast, all the California missions, you know, were being founded. In fact, San Juan Capistrano was founded November 76. But here's the cool thing in my research on this, and this is what I wanted to ask you. I was like, did these guys know anything out here on the West Coast, founding all these missions, of what was happening back east? And from what the best I've been able to tell, they knew nothing of what was happening on the other coast until Spain entered the war. And then Spain actually had Sarah, who was the padre in charge of all these missions, collect money to send to Spain via Mexico for the war cause. Did you encounter anything in your research about the California missions raising money to ultimately help the American Revolution?
A little. I didn't do a deep dive on the California missions in particular, but throughout the Spanish colonies, they were sending money back. There was actually demand from Spain across the colonies. So New Mexico sent money, and in Mexico itself, and there's actually a tax. They instituted a tax on pulque, which is this alcoholic beverage in Mexico. So people had to pay a peso or whatever it was on top of their drink. That didn't go over well at all. People were not happy about this tax on their favorite drink, but they did throughout the Spanish Empire in Nueva España and Mexico. They did support and send money, and we even had. The first cattle drive in American history happened during this time, sending cattle from Texas to Bernardo de Galvez's men in Louisiana. So that's another cool little story, but so many contributions from the Spanish that I think are overlooked. So I'm glad you flagged that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Derek. Any other questions for Derek? I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question, please help yourself. Wow, Derek, you must have done a really good job. Yeah, I see people clapping. This is great.
There we go.
John Scourge is telling us from New Orleans that the Galvez exhibit is currently going on at the Cabildo in New Orleans, right next to the Lafayette exhibit. We saw that when we were there this past June. It was amazing. Thank you, Board Member Scourge. There's a lot of great information in the chat from Ernie Sutton, who was apparently won a map, which I'll make sure you get the email addresses of the 4 people that answered correctly. Okay.
Great, thank you. Yes, I will send out those maps. And if anybody wants a book plate too, so these are kind of like small little stickers that that I sign sometimes. If you wanted a signature in your book, I'm also happy to
Derek,
send one to you. So let me know.
Put your email address in the chat, please.
Yeah.
And then what I'm going to ask then is, this will save me some time. I'm going to ask Stephanie Morgaine, Paul DeGastine, and Ernie Sutton to note that the email address. You can email him for your free map. Okay.
Yeah.
And Derek
yeah.
I'm sorry, Derek.
Yeah, the folks with maps, please indicate that you are a lucky winner. But anybody who wants a book sticker, for yourself or whomever, I'm definitely happy to sign and send the book plate back as well.
Okay, all the way from New Orleans, Louisiana, John Scourge has a question for us.
Derek, in your research with Galvez, you mentioned the Battle of Pensacola. Did you also cover the Battle of Baton Rouge?
Yes, yes. I went to Baton Rouge, and you can see, as I'm sure you're aware, if you're in Louisiana, there's a marker there. But I spoke with uh, somebody who's a reenactor and kind of local historian who was able to tell me about the battles. And I went to New Iberia in Louisiana too, which has this great Spanish community and still has like a Spanish festival every spring that kind of honors their heritage there. And so I was speaking with Robert Freeland, who interprets Galvez and works at the museum in New Orleans. And he was telling me that it's actually Bernardo is going to be part of the Louisiana school curriculum, I think, going forward, which is just great that they're remembering the contributions of this guy, because he was such a great figure. I tell you, I really liked learning about Galvez. He was such an interesting figure, and he assembled this multi-ethnic coalition in Louisiana. So he had free blacks in his army. He had Spanish and French and German settlers and Americans and Native Americans, and he somehow managed to get this whole group together and led them. And he was the type of person who would sleep on the ground with his soldiers. So very much sharing in the hardships. So he's just such a story and such a bold commander, because the British in Pensacola, which was their main base, they had more men and ships than he did. So you would think he'd be playing defense and be really worried. Instead, he just flipped the script and started attacking the British everywhere, and took Fort Montauk and cleaned them out of the Mississippi River, and then marched over to Mobile, sailed over to Mobile, I should say, Alabama, and took that. So such a bold commander, and I think one of those great kind of forgotten heroes, I think, of the Revolutionary War.
I have somebody doing some genealogy work on me to see if they can find something that would get me qualified for the Sons of the American Revolution. And apparently, there were many Cajuns
Mhm.
who, and that's my family history, that even though they're French Cajuns, they were under Spanish rule and fought for under Galvez in
Mhm.
Mobile and Florida. So hopefully they can find a connection to get me qualified. But
That's great.
it's just kind of funny when I was first told that they hear that here's all these Cajuns fighting under the Spaniards, you know.
Right. It's so funny. And just the whole fact that the Spanish were there for decades and decades in New Orleans just kind of was something I'd never really focused on, because of course it started as a French colony and it ended as a French colony before it was sold to Americans. But the Spanish had New Orleans for a long time and were responsible for a lot of the culture and the architecture even there. So that's also something that definitely worth remembering.
Great.
Thank you,
Thank you.
guys. Thank you so much. Any other questions, folks?
Hey Chuck, it's Marietta. I have a
Hi,
question.
Marietta. How you doing?
Hey, good. I have no video, so this is kind of weird to be talking to a blank screen. But Derek, I really enjoyed your first book about Jefferson, and I'm looking forward to the current book. And a couple of things about Jefferson's book. Number one, we know Fernando at Barbersville too, so that
Ah,
was kind of cool to read about him. And what I really enjoyed about the book was I read it a few years ago, and it was kind of like you were going on this trip with Jefferson, and we were getting ready to go on this bicentennial trip with Lafayette. So it was kind of cool that it was the same kind of experience where we were going to be following Lafayette the way you followed Jefferson in
yeah,
yeah.
yes. Well, thank you for that. Yes, mine was on a much smaller scale than everything the AFL did over the last couple of years. But I found this guidebook that, in effect, Jefferson wrote. It wasn't an actually published book, but it was this long letter he wrote to these two young Americans who wanted to travel around Europe, and he gave them homework like, "I want you to investigate architecture here and learn about winemaking here, and look at the landscape gardens over there." So my family and I went to a lot of those places and tried to learn about them, and saw how Jefferson tried to put these ideas in practice and sometimes failed. And of course, the winemaking was an interesting one. So this Barbersville Vineyards, what Marietta mentioned, this beautiful place north of Charlottesville that has a strong Jeffersonian connection. It's one of the earliest vineyards here, and I was just there this weekend actually, and by chance, and saw Fernando, and so they're up to their normal tricks.
Right, right. I think we're going to see him in a couple of weeks.
Oh,
But
that's
my
great.
question for you is, and I've kind of lost track to her age, but did Miranda turn out to be a chef?
Well, she was cooking some tonight, and that's my daughter. And yes, so they're my definitely incorporate the family in the books. And she was much smaller then, but a spoiler, she went on some of these trips with us this time around, and she is now a student at William and Mary. So she is really excited about learning about the history and learning about a lot of other things at William and Mary too. But yes, she and my son are both doing great. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Marietta. Thank you, Derek. Do we have any more questions? Anybody have any more questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So, sometime after Yorktown, Cornwallis ended up in India, if I'm not mistaken. Were those the battles that you talked about happening in India, or was that later?
Those were later. So Cornwallis, it was in the early 1790s. So there were this was a later war. So the French and the Mysore Kingdom did pretty well in the Revolutionary War, as I said, but the British then came and really had an onslaught against them, led by Lord Cornwallis. So he had, which is kind of hard for me to believe. He's the hero there for the British in India. And I saw this probably 10-foot tall marble statue of Cornwallis that the grateful British merchants of Madras at the time, Chennai now, paid for to honor him, which is kind of crazy because I thought, like, what a loser. He lost Yorktown and he left in disgrace, but he rehabilitated his image in India and had a very successful campaign there and became a hero back in Britain. And ultimately, the British did defeat the Mysore Kingdom, not in that war, but in their final war against the Mysore Kingdom 10 years later. I had a picture on my slideshow of somebody in the right-hand corner. I don't know if you remember, but that was Tipu Sultan, the leader of the Mysore Kingdom. He said, "I'd rather live a day as a tiger than a lifetime as a sheep." So he had no trouble constantly fighting against the British, but that's how he died. He died on the battlefield fighting the British in this final war, and Britain took over Mysore. It was actually the last kingdom that had resisted the British. So after that, they controlled India. So yeah, that's really interesting about Cornwallis. I had no idea before that he had this whole other war that he was part of in India.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Derek, my question to you is, can I have your frequent flyer miles?
Oh, I think you probably have more with all the Lafayette stuff. But yes, yeah, it was a lot of fun to do all these trips for sure.
That's
Yes,
great. That's
it was
great. All right, let's give Derek another round of applause. Better than applause, go buy his book, folks. I'd like you to have a great evening. Derek, you were fabulous. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much, Chuck. Thanks
Great
for all the support too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank